Today, our panel discussion is about assessment leadership for teacher leaders, and it's inspired by a course that we offer called Empowering Students Through Assessments. Our panel has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to assessment. We're joined today by one of our course trainers, Bambi Betts, who's the director of the Principals Training Center. Bambi teaches the PTC assessment course, and she also teaches empowering students through assessment, as well as many of our other leadership courses. We are also lucky to have 3 additional panelists with us today. Yvonne Cross is a graduate of our Teacher Leader program, and she currently teaches English for grades 9 and 10 at the International School of Amsterdam. Elizabeth Amende Cooney is the incoming assistant head of school at the Chadwick School in California, and she is also the founder of Advancing Educators. And finally, we have Megan Holmstrom with us. Megan is an international math consultant, and she is also the co-founder of Math Speak Global. Our panel today is going to be discussing questions that were generated by people who were originally registered to take this course with us in Rome. As you're listening to the panel discussion, I would encourage you to send us questions using the Q&A feature, which is on the bottom of the Zoom screen. And I'll also be saving a transcript of the questions. So if our panel doesn't get a chance to specifically address your question, we will keep that transcript and be able to get some answers to you offline. Just give us a couple of days. I would also encourage you to use the chat feature that is in Zoom, and you can also add comment on Facebook, because we really want, as we're having our discussion, to be able to hear some of your ideas and to have you share some of the tools and strategies that you use. So by the end of today, we can crowdsource a whole set of resources to help you in your practice. So with that, let's get started with our questions. The first question that was asked, and this is a great question for us to start with, is what are some of the assessment practices that I, as a team leader or department head, should ensure are happening on my team or within my department? And Yvonne, I was hoping you could get us started with some thinking around that question.
Okay. Hello to everyone. So the thing that I would emphasize, especially coming from a teacher perspective, is I can't overstate the value of moderation. And with moderation, if your department is uncomfortable with it, there are protocols that exist for it. But when you go through moderation, it opens up so much dialogue. And of course, it's important for the reliability factor that we are all on the same page with assessment, or we're even understanding the command terms the same as one another. And what I've also found particularly valuable is I teach, as the introduction said, I teach grade 9 and grade 10, but looking at assessment material from 6th grade gave me a strong sense of where students were coming from, and being part of a moderation process in the diploma program and looking at assessments in grade 11 and 12, also it gives you that sense of that continuum. So I think one of the most beneficial practices when you're looking at assessment as far as a whole department is the importance of the moderation.
Great, thanks, Yvonne. Does anybody else want to add on to that, some assessment practices that you should ensure are happening within your team or your department? Megan.
I'm happy to jump in. And I think some of this will maybe be further elaborated on from what Yvonne said and just some of the other discussions we'll have today. I think a lot about tuning assessments together. So even if you're a small department, and my lens is mathematics, but I think it works across content areas, it's that cycle of looking at them together before we put them in front of students, and then tuning them, getting that feedback, asking those open questions. So if your team is just 1 teacher per grade, or you have a larger team, great. And then tuning it again once you've actually administered it. So bring it back, get some feedback from students, and then have a look and do some of that sorting and sort of looking at student work, which I know is something we'll kind of talk further about. But I think that sort of cycle of tuning the assessment itself as habit, as part of what we do.
Thanks. Those are great strategies that have just been shared. One thing that people often ask, this comes up in the courses that we teach, it came up last week when we were talking about curriculum and assessment, is this idea of reassessment, or second chance assessments. And so someone posed the question, what is your opinion on second chance assessments? And Bambi, I was hoping that you could start us off with some thinking here.
Yeah, thanks for giving me one of the most controversial ones. So this is one of those ones that I'm sure everybody out there is, as a head of department or your group leader, you've kind of been handed, maybe you've been handed this opportunity to do this or not. So I could write a book about it. I've got just so many thoughts about this for you. I'm going to try to just make it very succinct. Talking about what you as a leader of a team or a leader of a subject or leader of learning for a particular part of the school, what's in your control and what's out of your control and what can you do. This is one of those ones that could be living as a policy kind of above where you are, and you are sort of have to be the executor of a practice that you might not agree with. So I just want to put the opinion part of it is, there's some things that we know to be true about it, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment here. But we also recognize that, is this something that your department or your grade level has got the authority to make a decision about? So I would say that's the first thing, is to know, is that in your control or not? Or is there sometimes assessment practices, many times assessment practices are driven by the system and not by what's really going to be effective for individual kid learning, and it's at this team level that we can, modify that, soften it, make it actually work. So let's just back up for 1 second and think about, it's not really ever a good idea, in my view, to start looking at a practice without looking at where that practice came from, before we start having an opinion about it. And that practice of everybody being assessed in the same way, or not even in the same way, but in the same time frame, to collect evidence of their learning, is just a bad idea. It was a bad idea to start with, and it still is a bad idea. So now we're left with, we want everybody to take this summative assessment over the same amount of time, and we're going to gather more or less the same evidence for every kid in the same time frame. And now we didn't get what we wanted out of that, and should we give some kids an opportunity to show their evidence in a different way, or giving more time? So in a way, I would remove the word chance, because chance doesn't really have any place in the learning. It's really more about the opportunity to show yourself primarily and others that you have learned. So if you kind of back up and say, if that's the goal, I think it starts to take on a different set of actual practical things. If, for example, here's one response. Let's say that you want to show evidence of the ability to write. That's what your assessment is about, and you've picked whatever types of lessons that you needed to get the kid to be able to write. I would argue that the question of second opportunity to show that you've learned that skill depends on where that skill or that understanding or that learning, piece of knowledge actually manifests in the world beyond school. So for example, if your goal is to get kids to be able to write the equivalent of a Newsweek feature article, you know how many chances you get to do that? How many opportunities? Multiple, over a very long period of time, right? So that would be one parameter. If it's something that in the world beyond school, really when they're using it, it's not going to be driven by time or one-off opportunities, then that's a guideline. If it's a breaking news story that has to get out in the next 5 minutes, you don't get a second opportunity. You have to be able to use that skill immediately, right? So the parameter being, what does this look like in the world beyond school, which takes us, which incorporates another one of the most important things about assessment, and that is that it always needs to be contextualized. Mm-hmm. A second one would be to, run your thinking around not, should I give a kid an opportunity to have a second opportunity in this instance, but overall in the bigger picture of how much evidence of what type do I need from this kid to be able to make the claim that they've met whatever the learning target or objective or standard is. All of us are in this conversation, right, about, look, learning is personal, learning is messy. We depersonalized it along the way, but it is personal. So the idea that one kid, we would need the same amount of evidence of the same type from every kid is just false. It's just false, you know. So bringing in to the idea, should we or should we not have a second opportunity to show our learning, I'm speaking as a kid, you know, think about, do you already have enough evidence? You know, if I haven't produced that evidence at that moment when you want me to. Remember that we assess learning, not work. Work is the vehicle through which we get that evidence. We create tasks, things for kids to do so that we can see their learning, right? If we are focused on the work as the main thing, then we start to draw ourselves into, when did you finish that work? And did you do the work to the degree of satisfaction that we have enough evidence? So move your thinking to, do we have enough evidence of the right type? We assess learning, not work. And if you absolutely are just rejecting everything that I'm saying right now, when we get to the resources, I will give you 2 examples of how teachers are dealing with the actual have to practice of everybody should have a second opportunity on every summative assessment. Yeah, you know, but I do it reluctantly because I think that it is a professional obligation to the notion of learning that we relook at it through these different lenses.
Great, thank you so much, Bambi. I think you've given people a lot to think about and some really key things to focus in on. And that is, we talk about this in the course, that there's a lot of professional judgment that goes into assessment because we are looking at learning, we're not looking at work, and we're really thinking about the context in which the learning is happening. And I really like what you said about thinking about using real life parameters to help you and your team think through some of those decisions when it comes to second opportunities for learning. So thank you. Another question that has come in has to do around rubrics, and rubrics is another big topic that we often talk about with teachers. And so the question is, what are best practices for developing rubrics? And Megan, I was hoping that you could share some of your thinking on rubrics with us.
Great, and it's a perfect segue to Bambi's response and thoughts around second chances. I like this idea of opportunities. And one of the things that I really think about when I think about rubrics is, you know, it's to take some words from Bambi's response. If there's a sort of an executive order of this is how we're going to assess, you might not have this flexibility, but if you're in a space where as a department you can tune your rubrics just like we would tune the assessments, there are really strong rubrics that already exist. So I like to take samples and do a little bit of the adult tuning work, and we'll share some of those protocols when we get to our resources. And we can build from those. So the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium claims are very popular for mathematics in the international school world. You'll see the 4 claims, and there are things like concepts and procedures, problem solving, communicating reasoning, modeling, and data analysis. So if we already have that and we have a nice sort of research-based piece of data, our 3rd-point data, then we can really dive in as schools and around our teams or our departments to identify what are our teaching and learning beliefs, because assessment is in there, that assessment principle idea is in there, and maybe what's our department philosophy, so that that can help inform those pieces that we're tuning. I think a lot, I'm just glancing at all my little sticky notes and things that I'm constantly thinking about. You know, one of the best practices I've seen when schools tune and when they kind of start to narrow to what they're going to pilot is to put it in front of students. I feel like so often we get busy developing kind of in our closed door spaces, offer it to students as a pilot to say, we're going to see how this helps you better understand the task at hand. And I just keep thinking through mathematics, but this translates across content areas. and that you can create that holistic rubric. So those 4 SBAC claims can be your areas, and then you get the feedback from students. And then again, we're kind of back to that same idea that I spoke to briefly earlier. Then we can take student work, we can take the rubric, and we can get feedback cycles going so that we can actually get to a space where we can adopt a rubric and have that be something that's in front of kids all the time. It's that idea of no surprises. Here it is, here's what we're looking for. And then that next process would be to get some anchor work. What does it look like to be extending or to be a 3 or whatever those quantifiers and qualifiers we put in there so that students know what it looks like. And it actually supports that idea of multiple opportunities, because you can reuse a rubric once it's adopted. Maybe it's highlighted in green the first time, and maybe the next time it's blue, and maybe the student piece is in pen or some other color to represent their thinking. So that's where my head goes, starting at the department level around philosophies and beliefs.
Great, thank you, Megan. Bambi, did you want to add some thinking there?
Yeah, more on the working with a lot of schools on this particular thing. When rubrics started to become really a helpful tool, there's a few misunderstandings that seem to crop up often, and I just wanted to add one kind of thought about that rubrics are not about processes. They're about what the learning looks like when it's complete. I think there's often a misunderstanding that we're going to go through a rubric and say, this is what to do. Here's the set of steps. We've seen this in almost every type of rubric, because there's a misunderstanding. So I would just, go back and look at your rubrics and make sure that they are a descriptor of what this learning looks like when it's complete, not the steps to get there.
Thanks for that clarification. And as we're talking about assessment and tools for assessment, you can't have a conversation without how do we look at student work. And so there's a question that came in that asks, what tools do you recommend for helping your team to look at student learning data? And Elizabeth, I know you have a lot of experience with this. Could you share some of your ideas with us around looking at student learning data? Oops, you're still muted, Elizabeth.
Sure, there I am. Hello, everyone. So when you're looking at student work, one of the things that's important is to all have a common understanding about what the learning outcome was, of course, and what the level of thinking was that you were assuming students had in completing the assessment. So making sure that you are all not assuming everyone's on the same page and understanding what that was, making sure everyone's on the same page. And then when you have student work in front of you, one of the things that I'm going to share as part of the resource is looking at the criteria for the piece of student work and taking it criteria by criteria and really talking about whether the student met or did not yet meet that criteria. And so by the end, it ends up being a big spreadsheet, but you end up having, a bunch of meets and not yet, and you can kind of see visually in front of you vertically if there's a criteria that students are struggling with, and that reflects back on, okay, we need to figure out how we're equipping students at the instructional stage to meet this criteria, because there seems to be a pattern.
Elizabeth.
Or you can see, participants that might be struggling with certain criteria according to what they're, oh, sorry. Did my connection?
Keep going. You were frozen for me for a second, but then you came right back.
Okay. Sorry about that. So it allows you to see patterns really quickly and also make decisions about students who need to be grouped according to their need, or students who need to be grouped and you can give them a different resource or come at instruction a different way to clarify what they missed. So I think that's a really important, just a way to visualize patterns quickly in terms of which criteria, and disaggregated by the criteria present in the assessment task. Yes, I think that's it. I'll stop there.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And this sort of leads into maybe the heart of the conversation we're going to have today, and a question that people ask so often, which is, how do we bring assessment to life in our classroom? So it really is more about the learning and less about doing something for a grade. We often hear teachers talking about students who are so focused on the grade that they're not really getting to that piece of understanding the learning. So I know that everybody has a lot of ideas they're excited to share about bringing assessment to life in the classroom. And maybe, Elizabeth, we could start with you, and then we'll have others jump in.
Sure. So I want to, full disclosure, I work quite a bit with Jay McTighe with Understanding by Design. I'm one of his associates. So those of you who are familiar with that framework or that training know about the term authentic learning, authentic performance tasks. And the idea basically is, we say to students, school is preparation for life. You need to hunker down and, really get the discipline you need and, and do well in school, because otherwise, you limit what you'll be able to do in life. And what we're saying is, why can't school not just prepare you for life, but engage you in the very things that people in real life are doing? So really thinking about making assessments less decontextualized and about a task and a paper and pen task that's kind of asking questions that aren't related to anything, and instead embedding whatever we're asking students to do in the context of a real problem that they might see in the real world, and a real, we have this acronym GRASPs that we use. So there should be a real world goal, because in the real world, people don't just ask you to do something and there's no larger goal. You're always trying to solve a problem or accomplish a task. So tell them what that problem is. Give them a real world role. You're not just a student handing something into Miss Amende. You're on an eco panel trying to figure out how to clean the air or test the water in your town. You are, creating a podcast that's trying to educate people on this issue. So give them a real world role, a real world audience. Your audience is not just me, your 10th grade physics teacher. It's and then give them a real world. So that's GRA. Give them a real world situation. Create some urgency around it. So why am I trying to devote energy into solving this task? Well, because, for the first time, the town is seeing an upswing in illness or allergies, and the data shows that this has only happened in the last 2 years. So creating some urgency around why they are tasked with solving this problem. And then of course you have some product and that's where the student work comes in. What are they creating or giving to you? And that product then has embedded in it the standards of the actual content you're teaching, right? So they're solving the problem. In the process of doing this real thing, you're also assessing whether they are able to do it. And really you're looking to see if they can transfer some of the knowledge and skills you've given them during the unit to the doing of something real, to the solving of something real. The other thing this does is also excite students. It shows them that we're not putting you on hold as contributors to society until you graduate. Even at your stage, at your age, you are well able to see problems that really do exist in our local and global community and use the learning we're giving you to engage, think about, take a stab at solving those problems. There. I know everyone has a lot to say, so.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Do we have others who'd like to add on to what Elizabeth shared?
I'm happy to.
Okay, Megan, will do you, and then Yvonne will have you jump in as well.
Yeah, I think I love this idea of bringing it to life in classrooms. And I think something that I'm always tuned into when I'm working alongside of teachers or with teams, and especially in classrooms alongside of teachers with students, is putting students in the driver's seat. And I stole that from Carol Commodore and Stiggins in the work out of assessment literacy. And it's that idea that they should know, and it's to what Elizabeth said, they should know what they're doing, why they're doing, where's the purpose. So I think a lot about how do we help them visualize it? How do we help them see where that sort of story arc is going and why they're doing this work? So if assessment remains kind of part of that cycle of learning where we're informing next steps or deciding kind of where we are in that continuum, or those opportunities, and as Bambi said earlier, those opportunities to show that I've learned something or create that evidence. I like to think about the scrapbook of student evidence versus the snapshot or the photo, the one spot. And so one of the things that I've seen, and this came out of some work where a middle school math team looked at giving students feedback first on their assessments before they even scored it. It was highlighted, and this comes out of Tom Schimmer's work, Grading from the Inside Out. So it was, here's highlight green again was keep going. You've got a concept, you've got an idea, you have a way that you explain it very clearly. And then highlight blue might have been stop here, pause, something's happening in your thinking. And so they got this first opportunity to think again before they ever saw a score. And I cannot say enough that for math students in particular, whose shoulders were up here all the time, all of a sudden it just became this, wait a minute, I get to look again, and I get to be part of the assessment cycle. And then they did, sometimes it was a peer assessment, but then it went back to the teacher. They had a parallel rubric that both the teacher and student assessed, so a self-assessment and a teacher feedback piece. They stopped asking, what grade did I get? Or what did I get on the rubric? They instead knew that they were going to get this chance to edit, just like we do in readers and writers workshops or in the language arts and ELA side of things. They got to continue to add to their thinking and develop ideas. So that idea that it's for learning. And I think that made assessment a live part of not what we do on Friday, because it's the end of 4 lessons, but it was part of what we do to learn. And it really removed this idea of test and created spaces for assessment for learning as just part of the learning cycle. And that for me was really exciting to see. And now I've seen it repeated and replicated in a number of schools.
Great, Yvonne, and then Bambi.
Yeah, I'm just going to tie in full circle because I'm going to also overlap with the conceptual learning or the performance task or the graph model, because I think one of the values of that is it takes it, when you want to really focus on learning, it takes the teacher away from being the audience because they identify an audience, and that takes away from part of that grade grabbing experience. I think it's essential that they actually, and they do have this authentic experience. And then I also want to tap into what Bambi discussed about work versus learning, and this ties in really nicely with Cultures of Thinking by Ron Richards. And in the Cultures of Thinking, it's really important, it's what you build in your classroom. So if you talk about grades all the time with students, that's what they focus on. If you keep discussing it in an element of learning, and this is what, it's part of the learning process, and this is what we're trying to gain. And it's okay if it doesn't make sense in the beginning. That's what the learning process is all about, and remove that fear of this, I won't make it right the first time. That it really is building a culture of expectation of, we want this to be a safe environment, and we really want this to be a learning environment. And the more that we use the term learning rather than grades and marks, we start incorporating that into the culture, and that's really made a difference in my class.
Great, thanks, Yvonne. Bambi, did you want to add something?
Yeah, the making it alive is making kids understand, and through our actions, that assessment really is learning. It's a part of the learning process, and we have separated it out from that learning process and said, here's the stuff that we're doing to learn, and here, by the way, is the things that we're going to do, sort of prove to other people that you learned. So I just wanted to insert into the conversation that, the kids, look, we all of these things are going to be helpful as long as we're not changing what we do with the evidence that we get. That's not going to change. As long as kids still have that thing coming out of their mouth that we create that says, is this going to count? We're dead. We're dead in the water. So this is one of the passionate things in assessment, is that as long as we are going to, through our practices, continue to value whatever all that evidence reduces down to, we're not going to get away from this conversation that assessment is something separate, that it is really what we come to school to do. And I know that by the time I'm in year 3, that's what it's all about. So if you're still hearing those kind of things from your kids, is this going to count? We need a counter to that. And at the team level, this is the most powerful tool we have, is that group of people who are shepherding the same curriculum, and making it opportunities for kids to learn, and then figuring out whether they learned it. So we've got to get a hold of this conversation, that it's what we do. There's 5 facets in assessment. We collect evidence, we interpret that evidence through rubrics and other ways, grades, all right, we interpret it, we feed it back to kids. That's the learning loop. It should stop there. It doesn't. We move on to record some of that evidence, and then we report that evidence out to other audiences who need to know. But if we're letting the reporting idea, the idea drive what's going on in the classroom, and that comes from the system. So you guys got to get in there and fight. You are fighting a losing battle unless you have the conversation about what are we doing with that evidence once it's interpreted. Who's the consumer of that, and where are the most important decisions being made about that? Or you'll continue to hear, does this count?
I think we could probably continue this conversation for the next half hour, but we want to honor everyone's time. And so we are going to transition into sharing some resources right now. I've seen through the chat that people are asking if we could repeat the names of books or talk about links. And so this is actually the time when we're going to tell you, I've asked each of the panelists if they would share some resources with you. And when this session ends, I will be sending all of the people who are on Zoom, you'll receive an email with links to all of the resources that you're about to hear about. For those people who have joined us on Facebook Live, I will be posting these resources on Facebook once we end. And we also post all of these recordings on our YouTube channel, the Principals Training Center. And you can look in the description of those videos to get the link to the resources. So there's a couple of different ways that you can access all of the great resources that you are about to hear about. And Bambi, we'll start with you. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the resources you've selected to share today? Oops, you're still muted, Bambi.
So the first one is really a collection of resources because we're engaged all the time in providing professional development and learning opportunities for you. We've collected on the www.theptc.org hundreds, literally, of resources on assessment organized under the course title of Empowering Students for Assessment and also Assessment Leadership. So you might want to just go there and have a look at that. And it's organized around sort of the facets of assessment as well as some other categories. So it's a little bit curated. So you can, if you want to look at rubrics, here's a bunch of sites to do that. The second one that I'm going to make available is sort of a one-pager, which is the set of skills that you would need as a team leader to be able to lead the assessment process. So sometimes, what do I actually need to be good at in order to be able to advance this process? The third thing that I will share is a list of 6 to 8 most helpful assessment practices at the classroom level. Just a list, you guys, not, you don't have to read a lot. It's just, these are the things, Elizabeth mentioned one, contextualizing all assessment, let's kind of drilling it down, and what are those 6 or 8? And then, as promised, I will give you the 2 examples of second chances, second opportunities that we sometimes use in our training. I am going to hop off the call, the webinar, in just a second, because we're running a similar program for principals in just a few minutes. So, and I need to get my act together. It's been wonderful being with you. Kristen, thank you for the opportunity, and go forth.
Thanks, Bambi. We'll see you at 10 for the principals. And for the rest of us, we'll continue sharing our resources. Elizabeth, can I have you go next?
Sure. So I have 4 resources that I will talk through quickly. The first is for those of you thinking about, one of the things that can happen is not having a bird's eye view of the assessments that are happening within your division or within your school as a whole. So the first is just an example of a school that created what they called an assessment map, kind of like you do a curriculum map of who's assessing what in what way. And it was a school district. It's an example of what an assessment map would look like just for ELA. So if you took grade 6 through 12, and what they did was say, look, in grade 6 through 12, we're all gonna assess expository, persuasive, literary analysis, and creative writing. All of us. So those are the 4 genres. And then they just went down and said, okay, in grade 6, how are we doing expository? So in grade 6, we're doing research. In grade 7, we're doing autobiography. In grade 8, we're doing a research report. And they wanted to make sure research, which the assessment showed were quite weak over the years, was something students cycled back to. So they got it in grade 6, grade 8, grade 10. So you can make decisions about which ones to revisit, which ones we don't need that redundance on, but it's very unifying, and it makes, just makes you think about what we're doing school-wide and being intentional. The second resource is a classroom assessment planning tool. And this is just for you to be able to ask yourself questions like, it kind of leads you through a sequence. What are our content standards? Okay, what are our purposes for this particular assessment? Are we trying to use it to inform and guide our instruction? Is it providing a basis for evaluation, or is it just diagnostic for student strengths and needs? Who's our audience for this assessment? Is it us, the teachers? Is it the students? Is it parents? Is it college admissions officers? So that's a question we don't often think about, you know, who cares about this data? And then really thinking about the assessment itself. You know, what products are we willing to accept? Can we differentiate there? I saw a question about differentiation. Is there room to differentiate the product or the performance or the process and still get at the standard? So it's just kind of a checklist that you can use in teams to talk through and analyze a particular assessment. The third tool is just a glossary of assessment terms, because I think there's so many and they keep growing. I'm sure this is already like, you know, data, but, you know, things like what is an anchor? You know, what is bias? What do we mean by the validity? What is holistic scoring? What is, you know, a performance standard? So just a glossary. And then the final one, and I left the cover page. I worked for an organization called Research for Better Teaching. So I left the cover page so you could get in touch with the instructors if you wanted to. But it's a classroom diagnostic tool that you can use to look at questions in an assessment. So it just basically, you look at the learning target and then you predict what are mistakes made or misconceptions students could have about that learning target or that they did. What are questions that assess the understanding of that learning target, and you can brainstorm, and then it helps you to be able to look at what misconception is revealed by each incorrect answer that a student gave. So it just leads you through a process of thinking through individual questions on your assessment. So there you go. Sorry, a lot of resources.
Our panel is very excited about the resources. Yvonne, could you share your resources with us?
Yeah. I was going to say, Elizabeth, I can't imagine anyone needing an apology for more resources. So one of the big things that I really like is, it's called the Visible Thinking Toolbox, and it's based in Harvard's Project Zero. And it is just a wealth of materials to really force students to slow down and dig deeper into resources and into thinking. And they've just updated it. It's a much cleaner looking interface working with it, and you'll be getting the link for it. But it includes things like, it could be something as simple as changing a question of, instead of saying why, saying what makes you think that. Because those aren't actually the same question, and one forces you to look for more evidence. So even like changing that language suddenly changes the thinking in my classroom. Or one of the things I miss with distance teaching and distance learning is think, pair, share, because I had my students do that all the time, which means instead of just calling on students or waiting for the eager ones to raise their hands, they have a discussion together, and you know that every student is having their voice heard. And those are just really small ones. You start digging deeper into something like circle of viewpoints. So as an English teacher, even like any kind of event, we think of all of the events that are happening in the world right now. So why is this person still thinking this way? Why is this person? And then doing those. There's one for brainstorming or pulling apart or deciding something is fair or unfair. So there's just a wealth of materials there. And then another quick resource I will share is, I actually have the book here. I'll share this with you. I really like this because it's incredibly teacher friendly, and that you can just quickly look for resources. So even things like when you talk about rubric design is in here, or how to help students with self-assessment or performance basing. And I just really like that it's quick, and it also gives you, because obviously knowing research is important as well. And that's one of the things I learned as a graduate, is you should always back things up with research. And there is a bit of this, but it's not like you're waiting through the research to get to the heart of it, because sometimes we just want to get to the heart of it because we're busy. So that's another recommendation that I would give. And the one last thing, you'll get this website, is there's Visible Thinking, and then there's Visible Learning by this man named John Hattie. And what I really like is he's done this ranking. So he's taken all the research that's going on, and then he's basically broken that down to say, okay, this is what we feel like is effective in teaching. And it's really interesting for me to cross-reference, what do I do in my classroom, and does he think that's effective or not effective, and why is he saying it isn't? Because sometimes there's some things actually I'm going, how come that's ranked way lower than I thought it would be? So also, and there's a website for that. You can get the book, but there's also a website. And it's just really fascinating as a teacher to cull through that. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you. And Megan, let's hear about your resources.
Great. One is kind of overarching, is just the National School Reform Faculty, which I think a lot of folks are familiar with. And that's where you can find tuning protocols. And they're generic enough that they can be tuning the adult work. So maybe it's that assessment tune. They also could be tuning student work or the looking at student work protocols. So that facilitator and sort of participant lens. But the piece that I get really excited about is in mathematics again. And it's called Principles to Actions. And I actually see some folks in our that are attending that I've worked with before. So they're probably smiling because they know I carry this around like in my arm everywhere I go. It's highly marked. And what the Principles to Actions did, and it's a publication out of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, is they developed 6 guiding principles for school mathematics and then 8 effective math teaching practices. And as I've worked alongside of colleagues in other subject areas, we've all agreed like these are just good for anything. What's good for math is good for science, etc. And there's an assessment principle in the guiding principles. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in the chat, but it highlights that if this is what we agree to, then what are those practices that are going to get us there? So it touches on things like lesson designs, instructional design, assessment design, and there's also one on professionalism, and it's the collective belief in efficacy of what we do, and it's also the collective commitment to professional growth. And I think that all of these things are looped together. So it's one of my favorite resources. It is available for purchase and download, but the executive summary is what we can share with everyone so they can get an idea if this is something they want to do. And the other piece that I highlighted was just the folks that are on Twitter. I mean, if this distance learning taught us anything, it's how much is out there, open and resourced. One of my favorites, and I'm not embarrassed to say it's just my little math crush, is Dan Meyer. He goes right alongside of Robert Kaplinski, Graham Fletcher. They're all doing incredible work around what is that purposeful teaching. And you can get some sort of opinion pieces on assessment, but just getting back into that open space of getting educators together globally, and Twitter is one of those spaces. So it's kind of a very large reach, like just get on Twitter, but get on Twitter and follow some of these people and engage in those conversations. It's the best way for us as international folks to just stay connected to what's happening.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. I think everyone can tell that we really could continue to go on and talk about assessment for a long time. So if you are feeling inspired and you haven't taken the Empowering Students Through Assessment course with us, we would love to have you join us. This is one of the new online offerings that we have launched for the Teacher Leader Institute. So in November, we will be offering this course online. And if you visit our website, you can register now. So as we're coming to a close, we have a tradition at the Teacher Leader Institutes and the Teacher Training Center called the Nugget of Knowledge. And during our summer institutes, we have morning meetings that always end with a nugget of knowledge. During our virtual community weeks, we have our course trainers doing our nuggets of knowledge, since we don't have participants with us who are typically the ones who present those nuggets. And I happen to be the trainer for this course. I was supposed to teach it in Rome this year. So today, the nugget of knowledge will be given by me. And I wanted to share a story with you for my nugget of knowledge. And the story is about a transformative learning experience that I had in my first year of being an educator, which was about 22 years ago in the United States. And this is a story about the power of student learning data. Juan was in the 4th grade when I met him, and he was in the 5th grade when he taught me how to use student learning data to transform an educational system. I was a bright-eyed, highly enthusiastic school psychologist, maybe a little over-enthusiastic, and I was working in a poverty-stricken urban school. Juan was a really smart and funny 4th grader, and he was identified as having a learning disability, and he really struggled with reading. Juan's 4th grade teacher came to me in the last 2 weeks of the school year because Juan, who hadn't displayed any behavior problems all year, was now starting to disrupt his class on a daily basis. I sat down and talked with his teacher because I wanted to learn a little bit more. And while she couldn't really share a lot of data with me other than he was just acting out, we were able to pinpoint the time that his behavior was the most disruptive, and that happened to be during reading instruction. So, like a good psychologist, I went in and I observed the reading instruction. And sure enough, the teacher was right. Juan was being disruptive. He was talking out. He was sort of acting like the class clown, and he was definitely disrupting instruction. So the next day, I invited Juan to come and have a conversation with me. And I quickly learned that he knew what he was doing. He was intentionally trying to get in trouble because he was afraid his teacher was going to call on him to read out loud, and he didn't want to have the other kids hear his reading. I did a quick a quick skill assessment with him and immediately saw the scope of the problem. Juan was almost done with grade 4, and he didn't know all of his sounds. And it really made my heart break. I was asking myself, how could we have failed him so badly? And I remember feeling really frustrated. One of the reasons that I felt so frustrated is that I had spent that entire school year having conversation after conversation with our school leadership team, talking about how overcrowded our special education classrooms were and how our teachers were really lacking resources. And I had been doing my best to try and advocate for change, and I just hadn't experienced any success. And each time I had one of those meetings, I felt really defeated. And I think each time I had one of those meetings, I can only imagine how the school leadership team felt listening to me complaining time and time again. It just felt like I was having this hopeless conversation. Now, years later, I understand that I was having the wrong conversation with a leadership team. And let me tell you how I came to understand that. So in the beginning of Juan's 5th grade year, I started working with him on his reading. We spent 15 minutes together every morning, and I gave him these short bursts of targeted instruction. Within about a month, Juan knew all of his sounds and he was reading short sentences, and he was feeling really proud of his progress. And so I had this idea, and I asked him if he'd like to go on a reading field trip at the end of the week so he could show off his reading. And he really liked that idea. He got excited. And so we brainstormed a list of people that he would like to read to. And they were mostly former teachers, but one of the names that he included on his list was the principal. The day that Juan visited the principal's office for his reading field trip was the day that, purely by accident, Juan and I began using student learning data to change a system. So Juan read his 3 sentences out loud to the principal, and he used good fluency and expression, and he was really proud, and I was proud, and the principal said all the right things. And I walked Juan back to class, and he had a huge smile on his face. And by the time I had got back to my office, the phone was ringing, and it was the principal, and he asked if I could come to see him right away. I walked into his office, and before I could even sit down or close the door, he said, "Why can't that boy read?" And I had realized I wasted an entire year talking about class size and resources when I should have been showing the leadership team student learning data. So by the end of that school year, Juan was reading at a 2nd grade reading level. He was still behind, but he had become a reader. He was proud of himself. He had confidence as a learner. He enjoyed reading. At that point, I decided that I needed to return to graduate school immediately because I knew there were 3 things that I wanted to understand more deeply as an educator and to really get better at. And that was systems change, the prevention of reading difficulties, and instructional design. But that's not the end of the story. At the beginning of the next school year, I received a note from a special ed teacher that I had worked with at one school. And she was excited to tell me that they had just received a new set of curriculum resources for all of the special ed teachers, and that the principal had actually hired a new special ed teacher to help reduce their class sizes. The system was starting to change. Now, fast forward another year, I received a new note from that same special education teacher, and she was now excited to tell me about her new job. She was now a district level trainer for the new special education curriculum that had been adopted by the entire district. So Juan made a difference. Juan's learning data not only transformed teaching practices, hiring decisions, and the allocation of resources in one school, Juan's learning data, and subsequently the learning data of other students in the school, transformed educational practices within the district. At the time, I just wanted to teach Juan how to read. But Juan taught me so much more. He taught me that you can not only use data to make adjustments to instruction, but that you can use data to lead change and transform systems. He taught me that data doesn't have to always be organized into fancy charts and graphs that you put in reports. He helped me understand that data should really tell a story. And finally, Juan taught me that sometimes the most powerful data is that authentic kind of data that we've been talking about today, and that's student voice. So my nugget of knowledge for you today is that if you want to help lead change on your team, in your department, or within your school, a good place to begin is with authentic student learning data, and make sure that your data tells a story. So I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. I'll be sending an email to you with everybody who joined us on Zoom with the resources that have been shared. And like I said earlier, we'll be posting a link to all of those resources on Facebook and on our YouTube page. I wanted to say a huge thank you to each of our panelists for joining us today. You have taken a topic that I think some people might think is a little less than exciting, and you have brought assessment to life in a way that I hope inspires people to rethink how they're using their assessment practices in their classroom. It's been a real honor to be able to have you share your experiences with us today. So for everyone, go forth and learn, and we hope to see you with us tomorrow for our final discussion of the week, which is going to be on coaching and supervising your team. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.